Good evening, everyone. My name is Sophie Gebreyes. I'm the country director of the Lutheran World Federation in Ethiopia. I'm very honored and privileged to be here this evening. I'm here to share my experience in Ethiopia, focusing on hunger and the toxic melange of conflict, climate change, and food insecurity. The humanitarian statistics currently in Ethiopia are staggering. 24 million affected populations, close to 20 million of them needing food assistance. Over 5 million people affected by conflict and climate-induced internal displacement. These are people who do not know where their next meal is coming from. The humanitarian requirements for 2022 for Ethiopia alone stands to close to $2 billion. However, due to competing crises and priorities around the world, most of them are not being reached by humanitarian assistance. How did we get there? As you know, Ethiopia was almost synonymous with famine, especially in the 1970s and in the 1980s, with newsreels of biblical famines moving people and governments to donate money and food aid. Canada was a huge food aid donor, so much so that one aid worker in Addis Ababa years ago reacted to yet another impending drought by saying, as long as it rains in Canada. You know, history has a way of repeating itself. When the Lutheran World Federation responded to the emergency in Tigray in northern Ethiopia some 40 years ago, the situation was eerily the same as now. A severe drought, exacerbated by a violent conflict between the Tigray People's Liberation Front, or the TPLF, in the north, and the central government, created a highly complex humanitarian crisis that claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, displaced millions, ultimately becoming the catalyst for regime change. Then the rebel group took power in 1991 and ran the country for the next almost 30 years with an iron fist. In the next couple of decades that followed, and with the relative peace, Ethiopia achieved most of the Health Millennium Development Goals, or MDGs. These health gains could not have been realized without progress in other MDGs: poverty reduction, education, access to safe drinking water, and peace and stability in the country. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization, Ethiopia made significant progress in achieving the MDG target for reducing hunger by half between 1990 and 2015. The prevalence of undernourishment declined by 57.2%, and the absolute number of undernourished people declined by 12%. Gains in agricultural productivity, the flagship productive safety program, safety net program, and increases in labor productivity are thought to be the main drivers for the progress. At the macroeconomic level, since 2004, Ethiopian economy recorded a high growth rate averaging 10.9% annually over an 11-year period. So what went wrong? The growth, the slashing of poverty levels I just talked about, began to decline after 2016 with the proliferation of conflicts starting in 2017. Since 2017, Ethiopia has been confronted with multiple intercommunal conflicts, causing loss of lives and massive internal displacements. In 2018, and again in 2021, Ethiopia earned the unenviable accolade of the country with the highest number of internally displaced people in the world. By the end of 2020, the devastating conflict in Tigray, northern Ethiopia, erupted, the specter from 40 years ago revisiting the country, pitting the federal government against the same TPLF, which after 30 years in power was relegated to a provincial power that did not sit well with it. While violent conflict remains the main driver of hunger in Ethiopia currently, it is exacerbated by climate change, economic slowdown, and high inflation. Despite having contributed very little to historical greenhouse gas emissions, it is severely affected by the effects of climate change. Droughts and floods have become more frequent, more intense, and increasingly unpredictable. Ethiopia's economy is mostly agriculture-led, with 80% of its population living in rural areas, but the agriculture remains subsistence and rain-fed, which makes it extremely vulnerable to weather variability. In many cases, and in Ethiopia par excellence, The consequences of violent conflict, the effects of climate change have conspired to create a perfect storm and weaken people's and communities' ability to withstand extreme shocks. At the macro level, high inflation due to the rapid depreciation of the Ethiopian currency, people's purchasing power has plummeted dramatically. In September, the inflation declined to 30.7. I said declined. Food inflation is also high at 35.5% due to the recent increases in cooking oil, bread, cereal, and meat product prices. Ethiopia is a net importer of food and among the largest wheat importer in sub-Saharan Africa, importing over 30% of its domestic requirement, of which about a quarter is for food assistance. Despite the war raging in distant Ukraine, the economic consequences began to be felt in Ethiopia almost immediately. Ethiopia relies heavily on wheat imports from Ukraine, from Russia, and from the United States. The government of Ethiopia purchases all wheat imports except that for food distribution. So what is the way forward? It is clear that without achieving food security, it would be difficult to build sustainable peace. However, the reverse is true as well. Without peace, it is difficult to achieve food security. Conflict, food insecurity, displacement, climate change, structural poverty, and inequality require a bold and transformative action to achieve peace dividends. We need to up our ambition to tackle climate change and build resilience in our communities. North-South solidarity is needed as rich countries are responsible for much of the historical greenhouse gas emissions to support low-income countries adapt to climate change through adaptation and mitigation efforts. Policy coherence is needed when calling for peace. Much of the states selling arms and benefiting from wars are members of the United Nations Security Council and G7 countries. The United Nations resolutions and call for peace are beginning to sound hollow. Food systems in conflict-affected countries are often characterized by a high level of informality, structural weakness, and vulnerability. We need good governance, strong institutions, and structures to promote accountability both in conflict and peace times. In the meantime, it is imperative that the humanitarian assistance is commensurate to the level of requirements in order to save lives. I thank you.